The morning fog still hung low when the Harper Estate collapsed into smoldering ruin, its once grand structure reduced to blackened timber and whispering ash. By noon, the townsfolk had gathered in silence, gazing across the scorched field where fire had devoured an entire legacy overnight. 12 children stood barefoot in the cooling mud, smoke clinging to their skin, hair thick with soot, eyes glazed not with tears but the kind of stillness that comes when grief arrives too fast to understand. Their parents, all gone, burnt in their beds, trapped behind doors that never opened. No one spoke of why the fire had spread the way it did, why the barn doors were bolted from the outside, or why the master of the house was found sitting upright in his chair, untouched by flame, with his mouth stuffed full of communion wafers. By sundown, the town needed a solution, not answers. And that solution arrived in the form of Reverend Elijah Cray, the quiet man from Blackwater Parish who always arrived when others turned away. Reverend Cray came not with wagons or sermons, but with a single lantern and an old black horse that looked more bone than beast. He didn't speak loudly or often. When he did, his voice carried the soft, deliberate tone of a man who'd spent years taming his own thoughts before daring to share them. He looked over the 12 children and offered no smile, only a nod, as if what stood before him were not 12 young souls in ruin, but a task to be undertaken, slowly, precisely, completely. He led them through the marshy outskirts of town, beyond the places where trees grew in neat rows and into the wild that smelt of moss, wet rot, and something older. The orphanage stood just before the Blackwater swamps, a stone structure overgrown with ivy and vines that had not been cut back in years. There were no welcome signs, no flowers, no children's laughter, only a heavy oak door that opened without a sound and shut behind them with a finality no child could describe, but all would later remember. Inside, the walls were bare, the floors cold, and the silence deeper than anything they'd known. There were no other children, no nurses, no noise, just rows of narrow beds and one long table where they would eat in absolute quiet under the portrait of a man whose name was never given but whose eyes seemed to follow. Reverend Cray introduced the house as sanctuary, a place where pain could be cured with discipline and the soul reshaped through surrender. He assigned each child a number, not a room, and hung wooden tags above their beds carved with Roman numerals. He told them the past had burnt with the estate and that names were clutter. They carried stories, and stories made room for sin. Here they would begin clean. They would live by the Cradle Rule, a handwritten booklet he claimed was passed down from an older time, though no child could read the ink clearly. Pages felt damp even when dry, as though they remembered the hands that had touched them before. The children tried to adjust. They learnt to fold their clothes with military precision, to wake before the sun and pray facing the cracked window in the dining hall. They learnt never to ask about the upper floor, never to step into the hallway after the third bell, and never to question Reverend Cray when he stood at the altar with his back turned for hours, whispering things into a dry porcelain bowl filled with hair and wax. At first it was easy to dismiss the rules as old and strange, just relics of a strict man. But over time they noticed something else. His presence was constant. He did not sleep, or if he did, none ever saw him do so. His lantern never dimmed. He knew when a child turned in their sleep or cried without sound. He would appear beside them before they could blink away the nightmare, offering no comfort, only stillness, as if watching how their fear ripened. One boy, the youngest, tried to run. On the second night, he slipped out before curfew and ran into the forest. The next morning, he returned in Cray's arms, silent and blank-faced, his legs covered in bramble scratches arranged in what looked like hand-drawn crosses. He never spoke again. The children understood then, this place was not meant to care for them. It was meant to mold them, piece by piece. And Reverend Cray, despite his quiet voice and tidy black coat, was not a man of mercy. He was a man of method, a man who saw them not as children but as raw material. Something to be shaped, something to be hollowed out and rebuilt. What none of them knew, as the fog rolled back in and the swamp whispered at the windows, was that the fire hadn't been an accident. That Cray had been waiting. That sanctuary had not been empty before they arrived, but something inside it had been sleeping, waiting for the next set of hands, the next round of bones and the next 12 offerings. And now, the field was silent again. But something had already begun to stir. Each morning began with the same sound, the bell. Not a church bell or a call to prayer, but a single iron clang that came from somewhere above the rafters, as if struck by a hand that no one had ever seen. The children rose the moment they heard it, no matter the hour or the weather or the state of their dreams. Beds were made in silence. Feet were washed in cold rainwater poured from a bucket with no label. The girls tied their hair with twine. The boys wore wool collars that itched and burnt, and all 12 filed into the main hall without a word. The table was long, the food was tasteless, and Reverend Cray sat at the head, chewing each bite exactly 24 times. No one asked why. They learnt quickly that to speak without being asked was a sin. To question a rule was pride, and pride, as they would come to understand, was the original rot in the human soul. The Cradle Rule was not read aloud often. It was kept in a wooden case beside the hearth, wrapped in velvet stitched with symbols that didn't belong to any church. On the first day of every week, Cray would remove it with gloved hands and recite one rule. Just one. Then he'd place it back, and the room would fall into a silence so deep it felt heavy. The children memorized the rules over time, though they were never allowed to touch the book themselves. Rule 7 stated that no child should touch another without reason. Rule 10 forbade eye contact for longer than 5 seconds. Rule 14 required the washing of the tongue each night with vinegar. But it was Rule 19 that lived inside them like a splinter under skin. Do not approach the locked door on the 3rd floor. Ever. It was not a warning. It was a law, final and absolute. The kind of rule not meant to be understood, only obeyed. They all knew where the door was. Up the narrow staircase that creaked in a strange rhythm, past a hall where the wallpaper peeled in perfect vertical strips, and at the very end, a door with no handle, only a black iron latch nailed into the wood. The latch didn't rust, not even in winter. Some nights, when the wind curled through the cracks of the orphanage, the children swore they heard it click, as if something behind the door was testing it gently. No one dared go near, not after the first time. A boy named Ellis had crept up there on a dare. He touched the latch. Just once. The next morning he was found in the chapel closet, his eyes swollen shut, his fingernails missing, and his mouth stuffed with feathers from the dormitory pillows. He said nothing. He never walked again. When Cray found him, he simply nodded and said the boy had chosen to remember the wages of disobedience. No punishment followed. It didn't have to. The fear of the door became its own religion. The children began to whisper about it, but only when the lights were out and the moon was full and the swamp frogs made enough noise to mask their voices. One girl claimed she'd heard weeping from behind the door. Soft, rhythmic weeping, like a baby who had never learnt what comfort felt like. Another swore she saw smoke seeping from the base of the frame one morning, but when she blinked, it was gone. Mercy, the mute girl, began drawing pictures again. This time they were off the door. Always the door. Surrounded by vines with eyes, by teeth instead of leaves, by hands coming from the floorboards as if the wood itself had begun to reach. She never looked at Cray when he asked her to stop. She only pressed her palms against the walls as if listening for breathing. Cray never raised his voice. He never needed to. He'd walk into a room and the air would still. He had a way of tilting his head that made even silence feel disobedient. He taught that the soul was a cradle, fragile, hollow, meant to hold only what was clean and perfect. He told them that the world was filled with vermin that wanted to climb inside their cradle and defile it, that the door upstairs was the last gate between them and damnation. That behind it was everything God had warned about but never named, and if they ever opened it, the cradle would break, and the children would be no more. Only vessels for something older than sin. Most of the children didn't understand his words, but they believed him, because his eyes never blinked when he spoke, and because no one who ever touched the door stayed whole. Days blurred into weeks. The routines became muscle memory, but at night, when the frost crept up the glass and the wooden beams groaned under the weight of their secrets, the children couldn't stop hearing it. The latch, clicking, waiting, whispering something they couldn't translate but felt deep in the marrow of their bones. Something that knew their names, even the ones Cray had stripped from them. Something to be remembered. Thomas was one of the quieter boys even before the fire. He never cried when the others did, never flinched when the wind moaned through the chimney at night, and never raised his voice at meals or questioned the endless rules that shaped their new lives. What made him different was that he remembered. He remembered his sister Lydia, 5 years older, sharp-eyed, kind, and the only person who ever made him feel safe. He clung to her memory the way others clung to bedtime prayers. And each morning, as the others scrubbed the walls or prepared dry bread under Cray's watchful eye, Thomas wrote her a letter, always on the same yellowed parchment Reverend Cray had given him, always with the same blue ink that came from a glass bottle so thick it smelt like vinegar. He poured his whole day into those letters, what the meals tasted like, who got punished, what he dreamed the night before. He wrote about Mercy's drawings, about the creaking from the 3rd floor, and about the way Cray stood in front of the fireplace for hours murmuring to something that wasn't there. He asked Lydia to come for him, begged her sometimes. And when he sealed each letter with trembling fingers, Cray would appear, smiling faintly, hand outstretched. He promised every letter was being delivered and that Lydia would reply when it was safe. That all things, even love, had to wait for God's timing. Weeks passed. No reply ever came. But Thomas kept writing. It became the one part of himself he refused to surrender. The others began to notice. Not his writing, but the way Cray treated him afterward. On the days Thomas wrote longer letters, his rations were cut. On the days he mentioned dreams or questions, he was sent to scrub the baseboards alone with vinegar-soaked rags. Once, after he described hearing a hymn through the walls that no one else had heard, he was ordered to sit barefoot on the chapel tiles for hours while Cray recited scriptures that weren't in any known Bible. Thomas said nothing. He kept writing. And then one day, while cleaning the hearth, he saw it, a pile of ash beneath the grate. Normal enough, but buried within it were the bones of parchment, curled edges, a seal broken, ink bled into soot, and on one of them, faint but clear, was his own name. He dug deeper, heart pounding, and pulled out 5 of his own letters, opened, smeared, and crushed like something rotting. On the last one, drawn in thick black ink, was a perfect circle, not hand-drawn, not smeared. A stamped ring with symbols shaped like teeth or gears repeating around the edge like they were meant to turn something. He didn't tell anyone. That night he stayed awake, long after the final bell, long after the others had fallen into that restless half-sleep the orphanage allowed. He watched Cray walk down the hallway carrying a letter, not toward the door, not toward any place mail was ever sent, but toward the chapel. Thomas followed in silence. From the crack in the wall, he watched as Cray laid the letter in a copper bowl beside the altar. He lit a small flame beneath it and whispered a language Thomas couldn't place. The letter burnt, but no smoke rose. The circle on the floor beneath the altar began to glow faintly as if reacting. And for a second, Thomas swore the shadows on the far wall pulsed, like lungs taking a slow breath. From that night on, he stopped writing. But the next morning, a blank letter and fresh ink waited on his bed. The children watched him closely, some with pity, some with fear. Mercy wouldn't look at him at all. He picked up the pen anyway, because now he understood writing wasn't about reaching someone. It was about feeding something, something that read his fears, something that needed stories. Cray wasn't sending letters, he was collecting them, harvesting them, and every word Thomas had written had been read by something that didn't live in any post office. Something that listened from behind the locked door, or perhaps worse, beneath the floor they all slept on. Mercy arrived at Sanctuary just after the first frost. The others were called to the chapel that morning, but Cray never told them why. When they returned, a new cot had appeared between Thomas and Ruth's beds. No bags, no blanket, no sound. Just a pale girl sitting cross-legged, hands folded in her lap, her dress too thin for the cold. Her eyes were wide, almost too wide for her face, and she did not blink often. When someone asked her name, Cray spoke instead. He said her name was Mercy, and that she was a gift from the Providence Parish, though none of the children had ever heard of it. He said she had taken a vow of silence before her arrival. That silence, properly held, was the cleanest sound God had ever made. She never nodded, never smiled, but she watched, closely, too closely. Within days, the others noticed that she always faced the third floor when she sat still. Not the stairs, just the space above them, as if she could feel something moving where no one else could see. Mercy never joined morning hymns, but Cray never forced her to. She was exempt from punishments, from tongue washings, and from the vinegar scrubs the others had to endure. Instead, she was given charcoal and a stack of yellowed pages which she filled in silence. At first, the drawings were simple. Cradle shapes, trees, birds without wings. But as the days stretched on, they changed. Her pictures began to show impossible things, vines that looped into mouths, eyes without faces, and halos made of rusted nails. One showed the orphanage itself, but upside down, its foundations stretching like legs into the earth. Another showed the locked door at the end of the third floor, but the latch was broken and something was crawling out of it. Not a person, not an animal. Just a shape with fingers where ribs should be and eyes inside its palms. She never showed these pictures to the others, but Thomas found them when he helped scrub the chapel floor and saw them stacked beneath the altar, as if Cray had placed them there like offerings. Late at night, Mercy would lie in bed with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if it were a mirror to something none of the others could see. Some children whispered that she moved in her sleep, not tossing or turning, but standing, walking to the stairs. One boy claimed he woke to find her sitting beside the third-floor door, pressing her ear against the wood, smiling faintly. No one believed him. But the next morning, Mercy's hair was wet. Her feet were dirty, and her fingers were smeared with ink that didn't come from any pen. Not black, not blue, but something darker, almost red. Cray said nothing. He only gathered her drawings again and lit a single white candle during breakfast, letting it burn down to the bone of its wick. The drawings changed again. Now they showed figures nailed to wooden cradles, their mouths stitched shut, their torsos hollowed and filled with coiled wire and dead birds. Some showed a face that appeared again and again, a tall man with no mouth and a necklace made of teeth. The same face began to appear carved faintly into the wood near the children's beds, drawn in steam on the chapel windows, and scratched into the walls beneath the coat hooks. When Thomas asked Cray about them, the Reverend only placed a hand on his shoulder and said that some children are born closer to understanding, and others must learn through pain. That night, Mercy drew herself, sitting at the table while others burnt behind her. Her eyes were empty holes, and the smoke came not from the fire but from inside her mouth. The children stopped trying to speak to her after that. Not out of cruelty, out of fear. She had become something else, a window maybe, or a warning. She still never made a sound. But sometimes when the wind passed through the upper floor and the floorboards moaned low and deep like something remembering hunger, Mercy would close her eyes and smile. It happened on a Wednesday. Rain had pelted the windows all afternoon, and the chapel's candles flickered like they knew something was coming. The prayer curfew had long been understood by the children. When the third bell rang, they were to kneel at their beds, eyes shut, palms up, and remain that way until the final bell sounded from the ceiling pipe exactly 1 hour later. No one was allowed to move, not even to scratch an itch. It was the hour of hollowing, Cray called it, when the mind was drained of ego and made ready for obedience. Most of the children obeyed it out of fear, but not Micah. He was restless and skeptical, the only one still asking quiet questions about the rules that didn't make sense. That night, 20 minutes into the hour, his knees began to shake. He lifted his head. It was barely more than a flinch, a breath of rebellion, but Cray was already there, as if summoned by thought alone. Micah didn't cry when they took him downstairs. He clenched his jaw and stared straight ahead, refusing to ask where they were going. The others were ordered to bed, but no one slept. Not really, because from the floorboards they could hear the dripping. A slow, rhythmic plink, too precise to be natural. It echoed up from the base of the orphanage, steady as breath, sharp as clockwork. The sound crawled into their dreams. It waited behind their eyelids. No one knew what had happened to Micah until morning, when he was returned to his bed with pupils blown wide, lips cracked, and skin as pale as wax. He couldn't speak. He didn't move. And on his forehead, centered just above the brow, was a small raw dent no bigger than a coin. Cray called it the hourglass. He explained it in his morning sermon as a tool of sacred cleansing, a method for purging rebellion before it bloomed. He said that when disobedience entered a child, it needed to be emptied through time, not pain. No blood was spilt, no bones were broken, just hours. Hours of inversion, of silence, of slow purification. The chamber was hidden behind the chapel walls, and beneath it a hollow well lined in stone and shaped like a throat. A metal hook hung from a wooden beam, and leather straps bound the ankles. The child was hung upside down, feet above head, body bent by its own weight. A single copper pipe ran overhead, connected to a rusted valve somewhere unseen. It released a drop of water every 5 seconds, precise, eternal. The water struck the same spot on the forehead again and again and again. It did not hurt. It did not bruise. But it broke something deeper. Thomas overheard Cray once speaking softly in the hallway to no one in particular. He said the mind wasn't punished by pain. It was punished by knowing it could not escape. That time, when controlled just right, was a knife dull enough to enter the soul without cutting skin. He said the drop, the same drop, falling in that same rhythm, would eventually convince the mind that it no longer belonged to the body, that the body was merely a vessel waiting to forget. Cray called this forgetting the first doorway. The children didn't speak Micah's name after that. He no longer reacted when they passed him food or whispered beside him. He stared at the ceiling day and night, blinking only when someone else did. Mercy sat beside him once and drew a picture in his hand with her fingertip, a clock melting sideways over a cradle. That night, the pipe in the ceiling dripped again, even though it hadn't rained. And somewhere far below, a latch clicked. Not loud, just enough for the children to hear and never forget. No one broke curfew after that, not because they feared punishment, but because the sound of water had become something else, something alive, something that now echoed inside them even in silence. The nights had begun to stretch longer, though no one could explain why. The clock still moved, the bells still rang, but the hours between dusk and dawn seemed to bend, like the walls themselves were slowing time. Mercy no longer slept. She spent her nights hunched over scraps of parchment, drawing maps in thick charcoal lines, maps of the orphanage, but not the one the children recognized. Her maps showed hallways that looped in impossible shapes, staircases that led downward beneath the foundations, and rooms labeled in a language none of them could read. She drew them in silence, then slid them under beds, into coat pockets, and beneath plates in the dining hall. Some of the children ignored them. Some wept when they found them. But one boy, Caleb, kept every one he received. He studied them, memorized the layouts, and followed the lines with his finger until he saw patterns start to emerge. Then one night he found a place marked in red, a corner beneath the dormitory, scratched with the symbol Mercy always drew when the air grew cold. A circle, inside it a cradle, and inside that, an eye. Caleb waited until the final bell and slipped from his bed. He moved slowly, careful not to wake the others, careful not to draw the attention of the walls. He pried up one of the loose floorboards beneath his cot, then another. The wood groaned like it didn't want to be disturbed. Beneath, instead of dirt, was dust layered thick with soot, and something else, something pale and round. He reached down and pulled it free. It was a tooth. Not loose, not broken, but clean, whole, and filed flat at the top like it had once been shaped to fit. He dug deeper and found another, then dozens more. Some were larger, some smaller, some cracked. But all had been arranged in circles, perfect circles layered one inside the other like ripples frozen in soil. No names, no markings, just teeth, deliberately placed, like offerings, like warnings. Like someone long ago had buried a secret and thought this might keep it asleep. Caleb didn't scream. He couldn't. Something beneath the dirt had begun to hum, not with sound but with presence. And somewhere far above, the latch on the third-floor door shifted just once, like it too had heard. The whispers had been soft, barely audible above the wind pressing against the stone walls. But in sanctuary, even breath could be treason if it came after curfew. 3 boys, Eli, Jonah, and little Bram, had whispered beneath their blankets, not out of rebellion, but out of fear. They had heard the humming under the floor, had seen Mercy's drawings left tucked into the cracks of their bedposts, and they had begun to wonder if something inside the house had started listening back. They spoke of the door, of the teeth, of the water that had begun to leak through the ceiling in patterns that no longer matched the rain. But their voices did not go unnoticed. Nothing ever did. The next morning, Reverend Cray appeared at the foot of their beds, not angry, not even disappointed. He simply said it was time for redemption and that water would cleanse what had been spoilt by doubt. The ritual took place in the wash house behind the chapel, a building the children rarely entered and never spoke of. It smelt of flowers and burning salt, and the floor was always damp, even in summer. Cray called it the vessel room. At its center stood a copper basin wide enough for a grown man, its sides stained with streaks that no amount of scrubbing had ever removed. A wooden stool was placed beside it where Cray sat with a small silver ladle and an open jar of elderflower oil. The air was thick with heat, no fire was visible, but the walls radiated warmth that made the skin sting and eyes water. The water had already been prepared, scalding hot, mixed with crushed lye, milk ash, and the petals of a flower said to attract spirits of the unborn. Cray's voice never rose. He spoke gently to each boy as he stripped them of their shirts, marking their backs with oil before guiding them into the basin one by one. Bram was first. He trembled as Cray lowered him in, his small body flinching as the water seared into his skin. Cray held him there until the boy stopped gasping, not from drowning, but from something quieter. Resignation. Jonah went next. He fought, bit Cray's hand and tried to leap from the basin, but Cray only smiled, pressing him under with the weight of his palm while whispering scripture that did not match any Bible they had ever read. When he emerged, Jonah was barely conscious. His lips blistered white, his breath was shallow. But he lived. It was Eli who didn't. As the third boy was placed in a bomb, the water had turned cloudy with oil and blood. Cray paused longer with Eli. He spoke more slowly, cradling the boy's head as if offering comfort, then pressed him down with both hands and did not stop. There was no struggle, just a stillness that spread like cold through the room. When Eli's body floated limp to the surface, Cray stood and declared it divine rejection, that the boy's soul had already been claimed by falsehood and thus had been denied return. He ordered the children to return to their beds, and the body was not seen again. The house changed after that. The fear that once hovered became grief, and grief made everything quieter. The children no longer wept. They no longer whispered. They breathed only when necessary and moved like ghosts through the halls. One of the girls woke with peeling skin across her arms. Though she had never entered the wash house, Caleb found a feather sewn into the hem of his nightshirt, though no birds had nested in the orphanage for years. Thomas found Mercy sitting by the window that night, her hands covered in dried flower petals and ash, drawing a single image over and over. Eli's face, submerged, mouth open, eyes looking upward, not at Cray, but past him, toward something else, something that had accepted him, something that now knew the taste of lie. It began with silence, an unfamiliar kind, deeper than sleep or curfew, the kind that made the air feel pressed down, as if holding its breath. Mercy was gone. Her cot still bore the imprint of her body. Her charcoal pencils still lined the edge of her nightstand, but she was not there when the bell rang. No child spoke. No one dared ask. Cray said nothing. He simply stared at the place where she should have been, then turned and walked toward the staircase. That was the first time any of them saw the third-floor latch undone. It hung loose, the metal catch resting on the floorboards, as if whatever had been behind it no longer needed permission. A thin line of ash trailed up the stairs, not scattered but drawn deliberately, clean and unbroken, forming tight spirals every seventh step. At the landing, the air shifted. It was colder, but not with wind, more like a memory. The door was ajar, cracked just wide enough to reveal a dim pulse of flickering candlelight from within. When Cray stepped inside, the children followed, drawn not by curiosity but by a force they could not name, something magnetic and ancient that pulled behind the ribs. The room was large, too large to fit within the dimensions of the house as they knew it. The walls were lined with cribs, perfect rows stretching into the dark, each crib holding a mannequin dressed in orphanage linens, identical to the ones the children wore. Each figure had its eyes sewn shut with coarse thread, mouths painted into faint smiles, and hands folded neatly over their chests. Some of the mannequins wore hair, real hair. At the center of the room stood a chair, not carved, not built, but assembled. Bone on bone, socket into socket, a throne of small limbs and hollow spines arranged with almost sacred care. It was child-sized, and it was warm. On the seat lay Mercy's drawing pad, open to a page that had not been there the day before. It showed the chair surrounded by the mannequins, and above them all, a towering figure with no face, only a collar made of knotted teeth and wrists wrapped in strings of eyes. The children did not scream. Cray did not speak. He only knelt beside the chair, placed a kiss on its edge, and whispered that the room had finally remembered what it was made for. Thomas was chosen without warning. Cray did not make a ceremony of it. He simply appeared one morning with the Cradle Rule pressed flat against his chest, his eyes steady on the boy as if waiting for him to remember what he'd been born to forget. The others were ordered to remain in their beds. No prayers, no songs, just silence. Thomas didn't speak as he followed, didn't cry, and didn't look back. Somewhere deep in his bones, he had always known his name would be called. The walk was slow but not heavy, like sleepwalking through the last page of a book. Cray led him through a part of the orphanage no one had ever entered, a narrow tunnel behind the altar lined with bricks that pulsed faintly under candlelight, bricks that smelt like metal and salt and something older than either. The air grew hotter the deeper they went, but not with fire. It was a dry, bitter heat that pulled moisture from the skin and left the lungs feeling hollowed. At the end of the passage was a door shaped like a coffin standing upright. Cray unlocked it with a key carved not from metal but from bone. Inside was the salt chamber, a square room barely larger than a pantry, sealed tight, every inch of wall covered in thick blocks of salt that had been scorched to black along the edges. There were no tools inside, no chains, no blades. Just a stool in the center and a series of metal plates nailed into the ceiling like wind chimes that would never move. The door shut without sound. No screams followed. Only stillness. Then, after exactly 1 hour, the air began to change. The children could smell it even from their beds, something sharp, mineral-rich, and almost sterile. The hallway lights flickered not like electricity, but like something breathing too fast behind the walls. Cray did not return for 3 days. When the door to the salt chamber was opened again, Thomas was gone. Not dead, gone. No body, no blood, no hair, no clothing. Just a single copper plate placed on the stool, its surface carved with impossibly neat lines that looked burnt in from the inside out. The grooves spelt a single word: stay. The word repeated across the metal in endless loops, growing smaller toward the center like a spiral, a trap for sound. Cray held the plate up to his ear and smiled, then placed it inside a wooden box lined with old parchment and feathered cloth. He announced to the children that Thomas had been successfully purified, that his soul had reached stillness and would no longer wander, that the voice left behind was proof that the body could be shed without pain if the mind was ready to surrender. He called it an ascension, but the children felt something else. That night, Ruth woke up choking on salt water, though no water had been drawn that day. Micah found a thin white crystal growing from the cracks in his palms. One of the younger boys opened his mouth to speak and coughed up a sliver of copper. Mercy did not return to her bed, but her pillow was soaked with a brine so concentrated it burnt the fabric clean through. Cray began sleeping beside the box that held the copper plate if he slept at all. He claimed the voice would grow stronger if left undisturbed, and he was right. By the 7th day, the box hummed on its own, the word stay faintly vibrating beneath the floorboards, leaking into the stone, into the wood, into the walls, and then into the children. It was Caleb who found it, though he would never tell the others how. By then, the air in the orphanage had changed entirely. It no longer smelt like dust or oil lamps or even the breath of damp wood. It smelt sterile, sour, like metal left soaking in blood too long. Cray had become more withdrawn, rarely seen outside the chapel, and when he did appear, his hands were wrapped in linen bandages, though there were no wounds. His sermons had grown quieter, nearly whispered, as if no longer meant for the children at all, but for something else listening from beneath. In this silence, Caleb wandered. Not with rebellion, but with a stillness that had settled in him since Thomas vanished. His eyes had changed since then, not wide with fear, but narrowed with something colder. Curiosity. On the third night without moonlight, he pushed open a trapdoor behind the chapel altar and descended into a crawl space lined with wooden cabinets, each one numbered in paint so faded it looked like dried skin. The one marked 13 had no lock. Only a strip of black cloth tied in a bow, as if daring someone to untie it. Inside was a ledger, thick, bound in pale leather so smooth it felt like flesh. It pulsed faintly when he touched it. No ink bled through the pages, but the writing inside was too dark, as if the words themselves had been burnt in instead of written. The first few pages were lists. Names, numbers, and dates matched with phrases like coagulation of will, hollowing commenced, and obedience fixed in core root. Each entry had diagrams drawn in extreme detail, many too precise for any child to have understood, but Caleb understood enough to feel sick. They showed tools that looked surgical but unfamiliar, long, narrow needles with no tips, clamps shaped like open hands, and curved blades with no handles. Some diagrams were drawn beside the names of children who no longer spoke, some beside the names of children who no longer existed. One page near the middle was titled Cranial Sluicing, Secondary Procedure. It described the removal of something called noema, said to reside in a fold behind the left eye, where memory learns how to disobey. The diagram showed a device shaped like a tuning fork, wired to what looked like a child's jawbone. Another entry, more recent, described a process called soul scaling, in which shards of formative sin were scraped from the spinal fluid and suspended in amber for future observation. It was signed by Cray's hand, marked with a symbol the children had only seen carved into the underside of their dinner bowls. An open cradle, cracked at one side, dripping a single tear. As Caleb turned the final pages, he found one marked only with his number. Not his name, for those had been stripped long ago, but the number above his bed. Beside it, written in red, was the phrase, pending inversion. Subject lacks submission, shows infection at root. There was no date, no completion, but there was a diagram, one he had not seen before. It was of his face, drawn from memory in sickening detail, eyes blank, lips stitched. The lines that led from his chest extended not to surgical instruments, but to a larger shape, a chair made of bone, just like the one in the third-floor room. Beneath the image, in tiny scrawled letters, was a single question. Can the soul be erased if the child believes it never had one? Caleb placed the ledger back in the drawer and tied the black cloth again. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something heavier. He now knew Cray was not guessing. He wasn't mad in the way people go mad from grief or loss. He was building something, recording it, testing it. Every act of cruelty had been an experiment. Every ritual is a data point. And now, it seemed, Cray believed he was close to finishing. Caleb climbed the stairs slowly, unsure if he was still just a boy or already a blueprint. It was the thunder that split the silence. Not the kind that rolls in slow and distant, but the kind that arrives like a scream, sudden, jagged, close enough to rattle the panes and lift dust from the floorboards. The storm came hard, blackening the sky by mid-afternoon and turning the swamp outside into a wall of thrashing branches and mud. The children were herded into the main hall while Cray stood alone at the top of the stairs, unmoving, watching the rain hit the glass like it meant something. Then came the crack, not from the sky, but from the bones of the house itself, a sound like something tearing from the inside out. The east wing groaned once, twice, and then folded downward in a slow, shuddering collapse. Stones fell inward, walls split like paper. The floor split at the seam. Dust filled the air, and when it cleared, half the orphanage was gone. The children didn't scream. They stood in silence, eyes wide, waiting for Cray to speak. But he was no longer on the stairs. His place was empty. His boots were gone. His voice did not call them to prayer or stillness. He had vanished, not fled, not hidden, simply removed, like a chalk line wiped from a board. The east wing had exposed more than broken bricks. In the ruin, beneath the fallen beams, were hollow shapes no one could explain. Pillars of bone embedded deep into the walls, spines fused to support beams, and ribs lashed together with wire. Some were child-sized, others were not. One beam had cracked clean in half, revealing what lay inside it. Dozens of finger bones, carefully arranged in spiral patterns, wrapped in linen that had once been white. The collapse had unsealed something deeper, a door previously hidden behind a bookshelf fused into the wall with melted wax. It led to a tunnel, narrow and low, the walls lined with smooth stones and scorched prayer cards nailed into the rock. At the end of the tunnel was a chamber, its ceiling too high to be real, like it had been carved downward from a much larger hollow. The air inside did not move. It pressed down like the silence before death. On shelves that ran the length of the room were glass jars, hundreds of them, each labeled with numbers, not names. Inside the jars floated human eyes, each suspended in a thick amber fluid. They stared in every direction as if still searching for light. Below them, in drawers lined with ash, were rows of dissected tongues folded like cloth. Some pierced through with pins or stitched with hair. Each tongue was tagged with notes scrawled in the same tight script Caleb had seen in the ledger. The subject failed to reform. Voice housed echo, purified and returned to silence. At the center of the room, someone had drawn a circle into the stone floor, not with chalk or ash, but with blood that had dried in perfect arcs. Within it lay a single object, a child's drawing, one of Mercy's. Torn at the edges, the page showed Cray's face, but not as they remembered it. It was stretched long, mouthless, with black lines radiating outward from the eyes. On the back of the paper was a handprint, bloodied, pressed hard enough to tear the fibers of the page. It wasn't Cray's hand, it was too small. They searched the orphanage for hours, but Cray was gone. No one had seen him leave. No footprints, no blood, nobody. Just the hollow shape of his absence and the things he left behind. The box containing Thomas's copper plate was still humming, louder now, echoing faintly through the walls. The salt in the chamber had grown white again. And outside, where the east wing once stood, the ground steamed as if the storm had boiled from below. The children were no longer children. They were witnesses, or remnants, or something worse. Caleb stood at the edge of the ruin with Mercy's last drawing in his hand, the blood still tacky beneath his thumb. He did not cry. He did not run. He simply stared at what remained of the house and knew without question that it had not fallen apart. It had opened. They never found the bodies. Not Cray's, not the children who vanished in the days that followed the collapse, not even Mercy, whose drawings continued to appear in libraries and train stations across the county for years. Always unsigned, always left in places no child should have reached. By 1903, the orphanage site was sealed off, first by local decree, then by federal order. Officials claimed the structure had been unstable, the ground corrupted by swamp gas, and the deaths, though never publicly numbered, attributed to exposure, rot, and spiritual panic. But none of that explained what began happening to the survivors. Those who made it out, Caleb, Ruth, Micah, and two others who refused to give their names, scattered across the state, adopted, renamed, and swallowed by new towns and distant families. Yet every one of them carried the same affliction. Each one spoke of dreams that didn't feel like dreams. Each woke in the same position, kneeling in corners of their rooms, palms open, whispering in a voice that wasn't their own. They spoke words they didn't know, prayers that sounded too clean to be holy, and when they tried to recall what they'd said, their mouths would fill with salt water. A journalist from Baltimore published an article in 1910 titled, "The Orphans Who Walk in Sleep," detailing the cases of 5 young adults, all from different towns, who had been found standing for hours in front of empty fireplaces, their fingers twitching in silent rhythm, their breath held unnaturally long. Each one claimed not to remember the night before, but all had drawn the same symbol in the dirt beside their beds, a cradle cracked open surrounded by teeth. One survivor, a woman who had changed her name twice since leaving sanctuary, agreed to speak. She said the voice hadn't left. It had only grown quieter, patient. She believed it lived inside wood, old wood especially, and said she hadn't entered a church or touched a cradle since the night the house bled. She had carved out her own tongue 5 years earlier, claimed it helped. Then came the recording. It was uncovered in 1912 by a bookseller in Annapolis, hidden inside a crate of hymnals donated by a defunct parish. A wax cylinder labeled only Voice Archive CR1. The bookseller played it once, then sealed it away. He claimed the voice on the recording didn't sound like it came from any human mouth, that it had texture, like something too dry or too old to speak, trying to remember how. The cylinder was sent to a university archive where it sat untouched until a student, unaware of its contents, played it during a lecture on early voice technology. What they heard was not music, not even speech in the normal sense. It was a sermon, measured, paced, and spoken in the calm, unwavering cadence that Caleb had never forgotten. The voice was Cray's, identical, undistorted, clear. But what chilled them was the room it echoed in. There was no ambient sound, no background hiss. No footfall, no wind, no microphone hum. Just silence wrapped around every word like a second skin. The sermon spoke of the cradle within the mind, of the need to unseat the will, and of how flesh rots, but soul architecture must be perfected. The final line was repeated 7 times. What is built in silence will remain after the scream. After the lecture, the recording was locked away again. But rumors spread. A few who had heard it claimed they began to see things, patterns in floorboards, shadows bent at the wrong angles, old prayers scratched beneath school desks where no children had sat for decades. The phrase Cradle Rule began showing up in letters from mental asylums, in anonymous confessions from the elderly, and even etched into the ceiling beams of a church rebuilt 3 towns away from the original sanctuary grounds. Caleb, last seen in 1917, was reported missing by a neighbor who found his windows boarded from the inside and a wax-sealed box resting in the center of his room. Inside was only a spool of copper wire and a note written in shaking ink. He doesn't sleep. He waits, in anything built to hold. Over time, Cray became a myth, a whisper, a name that couldn't be printed in church bulletins, but those who knew, those who remembered, understood that he had never been a man, not really. Or if he had once been, he had long since split into something else, something recorded, repeated, restored. Some said he had learned how to live inside rules, inside rooms, inside anything that taught silence. The cradle hadn't broken. It had been replicated. And the sermons they warned were still echoing anywhere a child knelt too long and forgot why. By 1923, the land where sanctuary once stood had grown quiet again. Too quiet. The trees that once leaned away from the structure now pressed in close, swallowing what remained of the foundation in vines and black moss. Officials, eager to reshape history into something palatable, declared the site a place of remembrance. A historical marker was ordered, its language carefully edited. Site of Blackwater Children's Refuge, Eston, 1854. closed under tragic circumstances, honoring the lives lost. The stone plaque was installed just beyond the old chapel steps, cemented into soil that still bore the strange cracked shape of the cradle symbol if you looked from above. That same week, 2 preservation workers tasked with surveying the perimeter failed to return home. Their last entry in the site logbook simply read, "The ground breathes." Their bodies were never recovered. Their names were etched into a second, smaller plaque with no ceremony. After that, the state ordered the entire eastern marsh fenced off, but fences rot, and stories linger. Decades passed. The world changed around the ruins, but the sanctuary was never rebuilt. No one dared. Locals avoided the area entirely, calling it cursed in whispers, though no formal record of the orphanage's true function ever made it to public archives. Then, in 1991, during a routine cleaning of a government warehouse slated for demolition, a sealed wooden crate was discovered. No manifest, no markings beyond a burnt symbol on the lid. A cradle cracked in half, encircled by a ring of small teeth. Inside were folded linens too small for any adult. They smelt of ash and flower rot. Beneath them, neatly arranged, lay dried rose petals, some still bearing traces of wax as if they had once been part of a ritual. And beneath that, wrapped in oilcloth, was the original Cradle Rule book. The cover was worn but intact, its pages miraculously preserved. It was thicker now, heavier. Officials brought in historians, most refused to open it. The one who did it would later be found on his office floor, curled beside a bookshelf, arms folded in prayer, eyes burnt white. No fire had touched him, no marks. Just a smile too wide and the scent of vinegar in the air. The book was transferred to a private archive where it sat untouched until 2002. That year, a graduate researcher broke protocol and scanned its contents into a private computer. Half the pages were illegible. The ink twisted itself into shapes mid-sentence, as if the language refused to hold still. But one new rule, unlisted in all known versions, appeared at the very end, scribbled in red ink that hadn't faded with time. It read, "Rule 37. If you read this, don't sleep facing west." No one knew who wrote it. The handwriting didn't match Cray's, but the weight of it settled across those who saw it like wet cloth over the mouth. Soon after, lights in the archive began to flicker at the same hour each night, 3:17 a.m., and computers nearby emitted short bursts of static, timed at 5-second intervals. The same pattern is used in the hourglass chamber. Staff began reporting dreams of being submerged in water that burnt without flame. One claimed to hear a voice whispering from the wall vents, not shouting, just asking, "Are you still empty?" The rulebook was removed from display and buried deep in government storage, its location now classified. But copies of that final page had already been printed. Some leaked online. Others were mailed to orphanage historians and religious institutions, and in one case anonymously slipped into a crib at a child welfare office. No fingerprints were found, just the symbol, always drawn by hand, always fresh. Today, the land around the old orphanage remains sealed off, though fence-line cameras occasionally capture figures at the edge. Kneeling, unmoving, often children. No reports are followed up. No one responds to the alerts. What was once a man has become a doctrine. What was once a doctrine has become a structure. And what was once a house has become a pattern. Quiet, ritualistic, and waiting. Not for worship, but for repetition.